So as we discussed in the last video, one of the minerals that you need to regulate relatively tightly in your body is called potassium. And if you have too much potassium, we call it hyperkalemia. And if you have too little potassium, we call it hypokalemia. K being the chemical symbol for potassium. And what can cause hypokalemia, not having enough? Well, if you are trying to recapture as much sodium as possible and you're secreting lots of aldosterone, remember when you recapture sodium, you pump potassium out because you're using those sodium-potassium pumps. So why is it bad to have too little potassium? What could go wrong? Right? How could it impact your health and physiology? Well, think about where potassium is in the body. We mentioned earlier in the last video that potassium tends to be in the intracellular fluid primarily, because we have sodium-potassium pumps that are pumping sodium into the extracellular fluid and potassium into the intracellular fluid. So if you have too little potassium, it means you're going to have too little potassium inside your cells. And to see why that's a bad thing, let's take a little trip over to Microsoft Paint. Your neurons and muscles tend to have a resting membrane potential, which means they are more negative on the inside of the cell than they are on the outside of the cell. And you learned about this last semester. Hopefully this rings a bell, this idea of a resting membrane potential. And usually it's around, let's say, -70. This could be a little bit different for each cell. And if your neuron is stimulated, you may allow some sodium ions in. And if you allow positive sodium ions in, well, then you become less negative, right? You become a little less negative. And if enough sodium ions come in, you become less negative enough that you reach what's called threshold, usually -50. And at threshold, all of these voltage-gated sodium channels open up and lots of sodium rushes in and you depolarize, right? This is what normally happens when you stimulate a neuron to action potential. It's the same thing that happens when you stimulate a muscle to action potential. You allow some positive sodium ions in, and if enough of them come in, you get to threshold and right, you have complete depolarization. Well, what if you've lost some potassium ions? And potassium ions are positive too. They're usually inside the cell. So if we have fewer positive ions inside the cell, instead of -70, we might be at, I don't know, -80 is what that number is supposed to be, or -90 or something like that. At that point, it's harder to get to threshold, right? You need a stronger stimulus to get you to threshold, right? The same stimulus might not quite get you there, in which case, you're not going to have an action potential, right? I'm sorry for my terrible drawings here. So if you can't, if you have fewer potassium ions in your body, that means you have fewer potassium ions in your cell. Your cells are going to be more negative, and you're going to be sluggish. It's going to be harder for you to fire action potentials in your nerves. So you can be confused, right? Harder to fire action potentials in your muscles, and so you can be weaker, essentially. That's hypokalemia. Now, what about hyperkalemia? Hyperkalemia is too much potassium, right? And this could be caused by a low pH, right? Because again, if you are acidic, if your blood is acidic, if your extracellular fluid is acidic, you can pump hydrogen ions out instead of potassium ions with aldosterone. Right? When you're pumping sodium ions back in, you pump hydrogen ions back out. In that case, you may want to get rid of potassium, but you can't because you're getting rid of hydrogen ions first. You can also have issues with kidney failure. Drugs promoting diuresis can cause hyperkalemia. Why is hyperkalemia bad? Well, let's go back to Microsoft Paints. In hyperkalemia, you tend to have more potassium ions in your body, and those get pumped in your cells, so you have more potassium ions in your cells. Potassium ions are positive, which means we are going to be less negative. So we're not going to be -70, right? We might be instead -60 is what that's supposed to say. I'm bad at this. Anyway, can I make that better? Nope, I can't. Okay. Anyway, you are closer to threshold, which means a smaller stimulus, which may not have gotten you otherwise to threshold, does, and you completely depolarize. That means your neurons and your muscles are going to be twitchy, right? And that is bad for a number of reasons, but it can lead to muscular spasms. And if that happens in your heart, right, when your heart muscles have to depolarize in a very coordinated fashion. And if they're twitching on their own, right, then you get arrhythmias and you can get fibrillation, right, ventricular fibrillation, and you can die. So hyperkalemia is very, very dangerous. And this doesn't mean you ate a couple too many bananas, right? This is much too much potassium. And in states that still have capital punishment by lethal injection, one of the ways that they do that, one of the drugs in the cocktail of drugs that they give the condemned is usually some sort of potassium solution. So how do you treat this? Well, if you have hypokalemia, you basically just have to eat some more potassium, right? Eat a banana, right? If you have hyperkalemia, longer term, you can restrict your dietary intake of potassium, or dialysis can help if the cause is renal failure. But in the short term, you can also get an IV that has less potassium than your blood plasma, and that can dilute it and fix the problem. Maintaining an appropriate pH in your body fluids is also incredibly important for your health. And we tend to drift towards a low pH, towards acidity. And that's for several reasons. Most of them have to do with metabolism, right? Our metabolic activities produce lots and lots of carbon dioxide, right? We know that cellular respiration requires oxygen and glucose, and it produces water and CO2, as well as energy, right? And CO2 plus H2O plus water becomes H2CO3 carbonic acid. And that makes our blood more acidic. We also make lactic acid when we're undergoing glycolysis and fermentation. When there's not enough oxygen getting to your muscles, for instance, you can make lactic acid. If you are digesting too many amino acids or proteins, you can get ketoacidosis. There are lots and lots of metabolic ways for you to end up with more acidic blood. Because of this, acidosis tends to be a more common problem than alkalosis, and your body has lots of ways to get rid of those hydrogen ions and bring your pH back up to normal, which is about 7.4. And one very easy way is breathing, right? Every time you get rid of a breath and get rid of CO2, that brings your blood pH back up to normal, right? Or helps. Also, your kidneys are very, very involved with this, because when your extracellular fluid is acidic, you can literally just pump those hydrogen ions out into your urine, and they're gone, right? We also have buffers, chemical buffers, which can temporarily store or release hydrogen ions, and we'll talk about those in a bit. And those are great for maintaining pH at least within a narrow range. So our blood and extracellular fluid becomes acidic because of metabolism in our tissues. We fix that by breathing and getting rid of hydrogen ions in our kidneys. And in the medium term, before we can do this, buffers help regulate our pH between 7.35 and 7.45. We have to maintain that relatively narrow range of pH. Some acids are fixed acids, which means they cannot volatilize, essentially. Means you can't breathe them out. And so some of these are inorganic, like sulfuric or phosphoric acids, which can be generated during catabolism of certain nutrients. Some of them are organic acids, things like lactic acid and ketones, but those things tend to be metabolized pretty rapidly and they don't accumulate very much. If you want to get rid of any sort of fixed acids, has to be through the kidneys. Kidneys are the way to do it. Now, volatile acids are things that can enter the atmosphere at the lungs. Primarily, we're talking about carbonic acid, because carbonic acid came from water and CO2, became carbonic acid. Well, we can go from carbonic acid back to water and CO2, breathe that stuff off. and that can bring our pH back to normal. So your typical pH is 7.4. You have to maintain it between 7.35 or 7.45, or bad things will start to happen. If you get below 6.8 or above 7.7, you are not going to last very long at all. Why is it important that you do not get extremely alkaline or extremely acidic extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid? Well, first of all, we know that enzymes have an optimal pH, and when you get away from that optimal pH too much, they can unfold, they can denature, and when they lose their structure, they lose their function, and if you're not undergoing the appropriate chemical reactions, you can die. But we also know from a few minutes ago that if your blood is too acidic, those sodium-potassium pumps in your kidneys that bring back sodium and pump out potassium can start pumping out hydrogen ions instead of potassium, right? To keep your blood from getting too acidic, they start pumping those hydrogen ions out, and then you end up keeping all those potassium ions. And if you keep too many potassium ions, your cells become less negative, and you can have muscles, especially in your heart, becoming twitchy, and that can lead to death. So in acidosis, where you are getting rid of hydrogen ions instead of potassium, you essentially can be hyperkalemic, and your central nervous system function can deteriorate, your cardiac function can deteriorate, alkalosis also can cause problems, but this is relatively rare. One of the very few situations where your blood can become alkaline is if you breathe too much, essentially. So if you're hyperventilating, right, you can be getting too much CO2 out of your blood, and that can cause your blood to be a little too alkaline. And so what do they tell you to do when you're hyperventilating? They tell you to breathe in the bag, right? So when you're breathing in the bag, you're breathing some of that CO2 back in, and that keeps you from getting rid of too much CO2 and becoming too alkaline. But that's one of the very few situations where you can become alkaline. I mean, maybe your diet, don't overdose yourself on Tums. That's not good. Anyway, carbon dioxide is the major factor impacting your body's pH, right? The more carbon dioxide you have, right, the lower your pH is going to be, and that means acidic, right? So H2O plus CO2 becomes H2CO3, carbonic acid, and carbonic acid, like any acid, tends to lose its hydrogen ion into solution. It becomes hydrogen ion and bicarbonate, and that hydrogen ion then increases the concentration of hydrogen ions in your extracellular fluid, and that means it is more acidic. If you get rid of CO2, then your pH goes up, becomes more alkaline. So your kidneys and your lungs are the most effective and important ways of regulating your pH, right? If your pH is low, you breathe more. If your pH is high, you breathe less. If your pH is low, your kidneys get rid of more hydrogen ions. If your pH is high, they maintain hydrogen ions and get rid of more bicarbonate. But there's another solution for short-term stuff, and that is buffers. And buffers are chemicals which resist change in pH, and they do that by picking up hydrogen ions and binding them when there are too many hydrogen ions in solution, or releasing them into the solution when there are not enough hydrogen ions in the solution. In this figure, Y is just a random buffer, and Y is right now attached to an H, and let's say there are not enough H's in the solution, right? It's alkaline. Well, then we will release this hydrogen ion in the solution. Or maybe later there are too many hydrogen ions in solution. This Y will bind to it and become HY. Either way, we have a way of regulating the hydrogen ions in solution. That said, buffer systems can be overwhelmed. If there are just too many hydrogen ions, your buffer system can't help you forever. Eventually you have to pee out some of those hydrogen ions or breathe some of them out. Your main chemical buffer systems are your phosphate buffer system, which is inside your cells where you find most phosphates, like adenosine triphosphate, right? Lots of phosphates in the cells. Carbonic acid is a buffer outside in your extracellular fluid, and there are proteins both in and out that serve as buffers. These are different buffers in different places, but they all operate the same way. They bind hydrogens when there are too many in the solution. They release hydrogens when there are not enough in solution.